Great. It's my pleasure to welcome you to the 18th Annual Jarvie Colloquium. It's hard for me to believe that this is the 18th. I invite you to set aside your concerns of your hectic day-to-day work lives and focus on this year's theme, which is mindful aging. And on behalf of everyone at Jarvie and our planning committee, we thank you for taking the time to join us. For those of you who don't know Jarvie's history, probably fewer and fewer every year, our founder, Mr. James N. Jarvie, was an important philanthropist in America in the early part of the 20th century. And in 1925, he established the Jarvie Commonweal Service under a different name, but anyway, it was the vehicle for his charitable giving, and he really did dedicate the bulk of his fortune to assisting elderly individuals. And the vision that was described by his heirs when he died was that he strove to help people live, not merely exist. And that's really our primary vision today still, through our individual service program, which provides direct social services and intensive geriatric care management to older individuals of the Protestant faith, many of whom also receive financial assistance. And we want to ensure that you all know that our program is actually accepting referrals again. And if you would like information about the individual service program, you can see me, and you can see some of my colleagues who I do not see in the room. Oh, I do. Susan Cohn is in the back, and she is the associate director and heads the individual service program. And Joe Garner, if you know him, is the person who does our outreach, intake, and assessment. So we would welcome referrals and can tell you more about that. Jarvie also maintains an enduring commitment to one of his core values, which was to serve the common weal. And that's really a term, an Old English term, which refers to the greater good of all. And I think of the colloquium as one of our opportunities to contribute to the greater good by providing an educational program for you all who work so hard to help address and meet the needs of older adults in the New York metro area. And we hope that this day will provide you opportunities for growth, professional and personal, to enhance your knowledge and skills, to network with colleagues, and to be rejuvenated before you return to fulfilling your unique and valuable roles. Our morning plenary speaker is Mark Agronin, and he is a board-certified geriatric psychiatrist who serves as medical director of mental health and clinical research at Miami Jewish Health Systems. That's a mouthful. And it's one of Florida's largest long-term care institutions. He also teaches psychiatry and neurology at the University of Miami's Miller School of Medicine. And in the morning plenary, he'll help us explore aging as having potential for personal growth, wisdom, and creativity, rather than in terms of losses, decline, and disease. And his book, How We Age, A Doctor's Journey into the Heart of Growing Old, provides many valuable insights. And he speaks eloquently in sharing stories of a number of his patients, as he says, in a manner of as humane and respectful as possible. And one of the lessons in the book that I was struck by was one that that I'm going to read to you. There's a lesson here on aging, a moral to the parable of old age that begins with the question of what it means to be old and proceeds, at first, into a realm of great complexity and uncertainty. As a doctor to the aged, I have discovered that I must embrace this uncertainty and hold on tightly, often plunging in up to my elbows and hoping, sometimes against hope, that persistence and faith will prove correct. I have seen, however, that regardless of the outcome, our greatest humanity emerges in the desperate process of caring for someone old and ill. The relationship we establish with our elderly and with their loved ones and caregivers by extension ultimately trumps the agony of uncertainty. Over time, uncertainty buys us time, opening up doorways of possibility that reveal as much hopefulness as possible. Absolute certainty may come only with the death of the elder, but that is a fragile certainty lost in its very expression. Old age is not a long death sentence, as long as we maintain these vital connections with its inevitable practitioners, for they eventually become us. And that's something that, as I read his book, really struck me as something that speaks to the work that you all and we all do in relationship with older adults. So we're excited that Mark is willing to travel from Miami here to be with us in New York City. And in the afternoon, our plenary speaker will be Neil Lane, who was very recently appointed as AARP's New York State President. And as many of you know, Neil also previously served as the director of the New York State Office for the Aging. This afternoon, Neil will help us understand the broad-ranging impact of changes in the healthcare and aging policy systems from both a policy and a practice perspective. And we're grateful that he's willing to present at this year's colloquium as well. We hope that both of the plenaries and all of the morning and afternoon workshop sessions will help all of us enhance our knowledge and skills and provide that renewed sense of hope. As of yesterday, there were 190 people registered, and I know we've had some walk-ins today, so we are grateful for such a wonderful turnout. And thank you to those of you who took advantage of our early registration process. You got to save a little money, and it really helps us with our planning. So I am plugging early registration for the future. And I think that you may be free of me. Is there any other housekeeping items? I do not believe that there are. So I, again, thank you for coming to the colloquium, and I hope that you have a wonderful day. And I will, without hesitation, welcome Mark. Thank you.
Good morning. Can you hear me in the back? This is good? Okay, thank you. Margaret, thank you so much for the introduction. It really is an honor to be here, and I'm looking forward to talking to you not only about some of the work that I do down in Miami, but in particular about the aging process, what we understand about it today, and what we can look forward to. Now, I say that as a clinician who works not only with older individuals, but at an institution in Miami where most of the older people who come to me are suffering from various ailments, either Alzheimer's disease or other forms of dementia, depression, anxiety. So I see what a lot of people would describe as the downside of aging, the side of decline, of decrepitude. But the message that I want to bring to you today comes from that arena, but really will speak more to the potential that we all have, regardless of our situation, that comes to us not in spite of getting older, but really because of getting older. So that will be the general theme of the talk, and we certainly will have some time at the end to hear either your comments or to address any questions that you have. So as mentioned in the introduction, I work as a psychiatrist. My specialty is in geriatrics. So the average age of the patient I see on a daily basis is around 90. A lot of people come to me in their early 80s, and I tell them that they're just my middle-aged adults. And the 70-year-olds are my teeny boppers. But when you spend all day with individuals in their 90s, you really get a wonderful perspective on the potential of aging. And I'd like to claim that Florida is the epicenter, but it really isn't. Because if you go around this country, you realize that every part of the country is becoming an epicenter of aging. I was just recently speaking in my hometown in a small area of Wisconsin. And I went up to Door County to speak, and they said, we want to tell you this is one of the oldest per capita counties in the country. So I thought, here it is, I'm coming from Miami as the expert on aging. They were more expert than I was on that point. So this is something that affects everyone, everywhere. And in addition to my clinical work, I run a memory center, so I see individuals with Alzheimer's disease, with mild memory changes. We do a lot of the latest research in Alzheimer's disease, and a little bit later this morning I'm going to be running one of the breakout sessions and talking more in detail about what we understand about dementia today, the different types, and what we're trying to do about it. So let's jump in and talk about aging. Now, when I think back about what drew me into the field in medical school, I would say it had to do with the stories that I heard from older individuals that I work with. That really drew me into it. I love history to begin with, but when you hear a first-hand account of history, it gives you a perspective unlike any book. And by listening to individuals over time, it not only gave me a deeper perspective on who they were and what they were going through, but at one point it really drove me to start writing about it and trying to capture something about their lives that went above and beyond simply the symptom or the complaint or the disease that was under my domain at that time. So I'm going to share with you a number of stories today because I think that often really drives our interest in aging. And I would venture to say for everyone here, when you think about old age, you think about your own aging, but probably you have a memory of an older loved one, a parent, a grandparent, a great-grandparent. And I always tell people that often what it comes down to is a single memory, a sensation, the taste of a baked good, of a soup, something that someone made for you, did for you, brought to you from their old age. And sometimes those are the most sustaining images that we have. So let me share with you a story that will bring some of the themes together for the talk. About 4 or 5 years ago, I was asked to go see a woman who had just been admitted to the nursing home. The campus I work at has the entire spectrum from independent living to assisted living to actually the largest nursing home in the state of Florida. So this is a woman who was newly admitted, and they called me up and said, Dr. Agronim, please go evaluate her in her room. So I went to the unit and I read a little bit about her. And I read that this is a woman in her early 80s, around 83, 84. She'd been living at home with her husband. They'd been married for 75 years. And then he died quite suddenly. And so within about a 2 to 3 week span of time, she went from living with this man after 75 years to ending up in a nursing home. She really wasn't able to live alone, and her children were quite concerned. They moved her quickly. So all I could imagine was that she had to be terribly depressed over this change. And when I went to see her in her room, the room was darkened. She was sitting in a far corner of the room, seemed to be slumped over in her wheelchair. I felt terrible for her. And I went up to her, I sat down in front of her, and I was feeling so badly. I took her hand, and I asked her, what has it been like for you after so many years to face such a loss? And she looked up at me, and she simply said, heaven. She said heaven. Was not what I was expecting her to say. And I didn't understand, and my eyes widened, and she saw that I was taken aback, and she said, Doctor, let me explain. She said, it wasn't such a great marriage. And I asked her, I said, well, so why did you stay in it? She said, well, I stayed in it for the children. So I asked her, well, how old are your children now? Well, they're in their 70s. And she went on to explain that this had been a pretty gruff individual. She put up with him for many, many years. And that right now she was ready to move on. She was looking forward to her new life in the nursing home. And it really struck me. And I thought, we have to be so careful when we make assumptions about what life is like for someone, what getting old is like for them, because we often can be way off. And believe me, I was off there. In fact, I still see her all the time around the nursing home. She's thrown herself into activities. She loves going to the arts and crafts room. She's busy. She doesn't have time to come see a psychiatrist, I can tell you that. And I see her children, often kind of hobbling behind her, trying to catch up with her. So for her, getting older and facing a loss like that was not about the end of her life. She did not come to the nursing home to curl up and die. This was a new beginning for her. And that speaks to not the experience of everyone who comes in, but it speaks to this notion of potential, of what we might be able to expect. And so I want to touch upon that theme about, number one, what really is late life like, or what can it be like, and what is this potential? Is it true, and what does it involve? So let me tell you story number 2. And I think about this because to me this is a good parable on aging. This is a woman that I worked with in the nursing home. And I think we'd all agree that as we get older, if you had to make a list of what's important to you, most people would say, well, you know, I want to have choices. I want to be able to decide where I live, what I do, what I eat, who I spend my time with. As long as I have some degree of independence, mostly in terms of the mind, in terms of choices, that would be good. And indeed, for this woman, she had lots of choices. And I had lots of conversations with her, very rich conversations. She was really into politics. And during one of the elections, going back a number of years, she was always carrying on about her candidate. She had a bumper sticker she put on her wheelchair. She was trying to exhort all the nurses to vote for this particular person, so much so that the local news came and interviewed her and talked about her voting. So this was a choice she was able to make. She also was interested in her son's love life. She was not happy with his girlfriend. She made that clear to him and just about everyone else who would listen. But this was a choice she could make. She could express her preference. She could participate in his life. I'm not sure he was too happy about that. And part of the reason he was not too happy about that, because at the time this woman is making all these choices, she was 106 years old. So you can imagine her 84-year-old son didn't want his mother butting into his love life anymore. So 106 and still going strong. So the question is, how many people here would like to be 106? Any takers? How about 110? Okay. Are you going to put some conditions on it? Well, I think that's what it comes down to. A lot of people would say, you know something, I would like to live that long if, and you can make the list what those ifs will be. Mind, body are in relatively good shape. Now, that's no guarantee. There's a lot of uncertainty. And there's things you can do to improve it, but there's still no guarantee. You can have the best diet, you can exercise, and you can still drop dead many years before you plan, or you can be like Madame Calment, who lived to be 122, the oldest recorded human being in history. Now, a lot of people have claimed to be older. You know, so we'll put aside the Bible for a minute and some of the stories. Methuselah, how long did he live? Anyone know? 969 years old. And put aside some of those yogurt commercials that used to be on TV. A lot of people claiming to be much older. But we have documents, and that's a copy of her document where it tells her age. They had it recorded in a reliable civic listing. Fascinating woman. She recalls watching the Eiffel Tower being built. Her father was an art dealer, and she tells the story how when she was a little girl, this very scruffy and somewhat unpleasant artist used to hang around his studio by the name of Vincent van Gogh. He was not a big fan of his. When she was in her 90s, a French attorney approached her and he said, I'd like to make a deal with you. I will pay you an annuity every year, and upon your death, I will get your property. Somewhat of a French version of a reverse mortgage. And she said, okay, where do I sign? Now, of course, by the time of her death, he was long gone, and his children were still paying this annuity to her, so you never know. And in fact, up until the age of 116, she said one of her secrets was she used to have a glass of port and a cigar every day. And at 116, she said, okay, it's time to quit. Now, I'm not endorsing either, but the point being that you simply don't know. And we'll talk about the aging process, about what are some of these factors, and is there any way that we can increase the odds for us. Let's take a look at another woman, a Dutch woman, Henrique van Andelschipper, lived to be 115 years old. And they asked her, well, what is your secret? What do you think? What was her secret to living to be 115? Low-calorie diet? Zumba classes every day? What do you think was her secret? Well, she said there's two parts to it. Number one is glass of orange juice every day. Okay. Not too bad. Some vitamin C, some fruit, plus pickled herring. This is her secret combination. I'm not sure she combined the two. I've taken a little creative license there. But this is her secret. And I have to tell you, whatever she did at work, because when they tested her at the age of 112 with IQ testing, she scored like your average 70-year-old. And when she passed on, she had donated her brain for study, and they found that it looked like the brain of a 70-year-old. They didn't see all the plaques and the tangles and all the changes, the pathology that we typically see in the brain of someone, forget about 115, someone who's 80. Really remarkable. We want to know what really was going on with her that made such a difference. But again, this speaks to potential, something that the body, the mind, at least is capable of. And the question is, well, is there any way that we can get there? What can we do? But I want to caution that, as we see with all these situations, it's not so much about living longer. It's about living better. And that's really what we'll talk about, because there is the uncertainty. No one knows how long they will live. And it's unlikely, as we'll talk about, that we will become immortal beings. But in the time we have, what can we do for ourselves? And more importantly, what can we do for others to give meaning and purpose to life? The elements that really make the difference for people throughout the entire lifespan. So let's get back to this question. Can we live forever? And of course it begs the question, do we want to live forever? There's a multi-billion-dollar anti-aging industry, or I should say so-called anti-aging industry, selling all sorts of lotions and potions and pills claiming to reverse the aging process. Since the myth of Ponce de Leon, in search of the fountain of youth, people are still trying to sell a piece of it. And I can tell you, from living in Florida, I went to the fountain of youth. If you go to St. Augustine, Florida, there's a park, supposedly where Ponce de Leon first landed. When he landed, he met the Timucua Indians, who were very tall. They were taller than the average European. They were very healthy. And so historians at the time made the assumption that they must be some sort of special beings. They must have some secret ingredient to long life. They really didn't live that much longer than anyone else, but they looked like they did. And there's a little pool in this park in St. Augustine. I went, I drank of its waters. You can buy them, by the way, for $5.95 a bottle. I'm not sure I got any younger, but I certainly paid something for it. And that's often what anti-aging is about. Now, I spent a lot of time working on a book, and it's done okay. If I really wanted to write a New York Times bestseller, Stop Aging Now. Author hasn't stopped aging, I hate to tell you. And I don't think anyone else who's read the book. But what is it? It's about pills, potions, lotions that can make a difference. Do they really make a difference? Well, we'll talk a little bit about that. But look at the messages that this anti-aging industry is sending to us now. There's something here called Stop Aging, Start Living. I'm not sure what's in that tube, but think about the message that it sends, that as you get older, you stop living, that there's a problem with getting older. I think anyone getting older would take offense to that. But this is often the message that people sell. Inaccurately, but they sell it and people pay for it. So, if we look at the scales of aging, we know we have to face lots of difficulties. Memory loss, changes in role, for some people retirement, from others loss of a loved one, loss of a spouse, poverty. If you work in social services, you know that one of the major difficulties and limitations for people as they age is poverty. It can be well and good to have the best medical care in the universe, but if you can't access it, if you can't pay for it, what good does it do you? And physical decline, loss of strength, loss of what some people consider their beauty, their attractiveness. So these are all the challenges that people face. These have been parts of the aging process. They will always be parts of the aging process. What can we balance it with? What is that X factor that's going to somehow make a difference here, that's going to turn the tide, that will make us live longer, live better, whatever your goal is? So let's talk about these X factors and try to have an understanding of the aging process and the potential. And the reason this is so relevant is as follows. What I do during the day is about as medical, as scientific as you can get. People come to me and they're looking for pills. They want medications adjusted. We do brain scans. It can be a very narrow window. But at the end of the day, I know and I see what makes a difference is when I can look at someone and have a sense for who they are as a person, what the aging process has been for them as they define it, as they tell me, and their potential. And if I can somehow help them tap into that potential, it makes all the difference for them, and frankly, it makes all the difference for me as well. So that's why trying to get a sense for this X factor, as I'm calling it, is so important. And I want to give you another perspective on this X factor, which really speaks to the urgency here. There's a paper that came out a number of years ago called Solving for X. What do they mean? Well, they're referring to a really interesting, monumental X, and that is the fact that in 2017, for the first time in recorded human history, the number of individuals on this planet, as you can see, who are 65 years and above will equal and begin to surpass the number of individuals who are 5 years and younger. So much so that by 2050 there will be over 2 billion people on the planet who are 65 and above. We are becoming a geriatric planet. Not just in the U.S., not just in so-called westernized countries, but in China and India, all over the place. The average age is increasing. And so we need to think about what is late life going to be. Think about this. When Medicare was created, 65 was retirement age. And back in the 60s, when you were 65, most people were quite old from about every perspective. And you could count on a hand or two the years you had left. How about today? 65. 65 really is too young even to come see me. I have very few 65-year-olds. That's a fetus on my scale. Medicare planners didn't anticipate how that would change, and it will continue to change, because what it means to be 65 is vastly different, and I guarantee you what it means to 85 and 95 will be vastly different in the coming years. There's no question about that. So, let's talk about the aging process. Why do we age? What causes aging, and is there really anything we can do about it? Is there any of these potions and pills and lotions, whatever you're buying, whatever supplements you're taking, can they really make a difference? So I'm going to give you a quick primer on the aging process. And what I like to do is give you a very straightforward analogy. If you talk about aging, let's break down to our basic building units, our cells. And I want to compare a cell to a house. If you've ever had the experience of building a house or redecorating an apartment, a condo, whatever, I realize this is Manhattan, probably not too many of you living in houses, but the day you finish, what happens? It begins to age, begins to change. What will determine how well it ages, how long it lasts? Well, there are three basic factors we'll talk about. Number one is what it's made out of, the material. So if you build a house, you live in a place made of bricks, it probably will last longer than if it's made out of sticks or straw, depending on many other factors, but in general. What's the comparison in our human cells? Our DNA. Because our DNA codes for the proteins, all the substances that we are made of. If you have DNA that gives you vulnerabilities to certain disease states, those are like inborn weaknesses to the roof, to the foundation, to the walls. And so that may be why Madame Calment can smoke and drink every day and live to be 122, and other people can do that and not make it past 65 because their genetics are different. They have greater vulnerabilities. And think about it like a house. If you have a weak roof and you live in a windy area, you will have more problems than if you live in a calm area. So what we are made of largely determines our vulnerabilities and how long we're going to live. There's no long life gene. So you can study 100-year-olds. You're not going to find a gene that says this gives you long life, like it's like a magic ticket that you have. It's not a matter of that. And think about this from the standpoint of evolution. There's no advantage to having a long life gene. All evolution wants you to do is reproduce, care for the young for a few years, and guess what? Evolution doesn't have much use for you beyond that. So there's no reason why that whole process would select out for a gene to make you older. Evolution wants to get you to 20, 24. Once it does that, and if you look at the way we age, that's pretty much the time when our bodies stop growing and completely regenerating many of our cells is roughly late adolescence, when we reach reproductive maturity. So that's in many ways the time when the bodies really begin to age. Number 2 factor is upkeep. Your house, your apartment, your condo, wherever you live, builds up junk over time. Garbage, dust, soot, whatever. And if you don't clean it up, if you don't get rid of it, that's going to slow down how much you can do in the environment, how efficient you are, what else you can bring into that area. That junk we have to maintain. The analogy for our bodies, our cells also build up junk. There's something called lipofuscin. It's a waste product from the metabolic processes of the cell. It builds up in our cells over time, and the cell is less efficient of getting rid of it over time. And this slows it down. So if you're talking about a muscle fiber, it doesn't twitch as quickly. A brain cell might not send a signal as quickly or as efficiently because of these waste products that build up and literally impede the spread of the impulse or slow down the production of a protein or a hormone, whatever the cell is supposed to do. Now, we can upkeep our bodies, maintain our bodies better, exercise, diet. If you have diabetes, high blood pressure, get that under control. These make an enormous difference. In fact, if you ask why did the lifespan on average go from about the age of 50 in 1900 to now in the late 80s, it's really related to a number of basic things. Number 1, antibiotics. Number 2, vaccines. Number 3, changes in lifestyle and control of blood pressure, cholesterol, things that we didn't really think about back in the 40s and 50s. We didn't know about for the most part. So this upkeep makes an enormous difference, but only up to a certain limit, as we'll talk about. Final component is the environment. So if you live in a hurricane-prone region of the country, as I do, and a hurricane comes and you're living in a house made of sticks, you're in big trouble. If you simply live in an environment where there's a sun, the sun beats down on us, and that radiation takes its toll over time. It causes mutations in our DNA. It causes wear and tear on our skin. And there's not much you can do about that. Now, this is where a lot of these lotions and potions and pills come in, saying that somehow you can undo this damage. We have natural processes in our body to try to deal with some of this damage, to try to reverse it, but they're very limited. There's only so much they can do over time, and they become less efficient with it over time. And this is why individuals in their 90s and above are more prone to cancers and other diseases than young individuals, because that repair system can only do so much. And so we boil this down to 3 basic aging or reasons we age. Number 1 is programmed aging. We have built-in genetic mechanisms that give us vulnerabilities to certain diseases that are limited in terms of what they can do for us to keep us around in this environment. Number 2, wear and tear, accumulating damage, accumulating junk within your cells, tissue damage over time. An 80-year-old liver is not going to be as efficient as a 20-year-old liver. It won't happen. The fastest 80-year-old can run faster than most of us in the room, but they're never going to run as fast as the fastest 20-year-old. That's just the reality of it. And finally, the effects of disease that lead to irreparable damage. So, for instance, when people come to me with Alzheimer's disease, there's been a toxic process going on in the brain that has caused damage that we simply can't reverse. And when we talk about anti-aging, it's really the brain where we reach the main stumbling block here. Because you can imagine if you can replace lots of parts, when you try to replace a brain, that's where I think we'd agree it gets a little sticky. Nonetheless, some researchers claim that we will one day be able to re-engineer the way we age. That if we can just understand these basic processes that age ourselves, we can counteract them. And this will, in essence, help us to become maybe immortal in some respect. Maybe we will be like Tortopsis dohrnii, a jellyfish about the size of a thimble that grows to an adult and then it regresses back to a spore. It grows back to an adult and back to a spore. Now, not that we would want that to be our life cycle, but it's able to regenerate itself seemingly endlessly, at least as far as we know. And Aubrey de Grey, pictured here, is one of these prolongevists, as he calls himself. And he says we are beginning to understand how we age, and then we can reverse it. He says aging is bad. It's a disease, and we need to cure it. Now, not everyone agrees with him. In fact, most anti-aging researchers don't agree with him. But here's an example some people give. If you look at the lifespan of a mouse, it's pretty short. And if you starve the mice, well, let me put that in another term. If you restrict its calories, as some people claim they can do, you can prolong the life of the mouse. You can almost double their lifespan. And some people think it really has to do with, if you look at the powerhouse of the cell, the mitochondria, the more calories it's burning, it's like running an engine on high all the time. It's just more wear and tear. If you can slow that down, you can slow down aging. So that's one example. He says we'll be able to make a change. And think about that. If someone invented a pill you could take that would stop aging, what age would you take the pill at? 30? 40? 80? Think about that. Imagine a world in which you coexist with your parents, your grandparents, your great-grandparents, your great-great-grandparents, your great-great-great-grandparents. That family business isn't coming your way, if that's the case. And we might say, well, hey, there's some wonderful, amazing people that will live forever, but there's also some mean, nasty people who, guess what, are going to be there right along with them. So some people look at this and say, you know, we don't even want to do this. You have your chance on the stage. Take it. Life moves you on then. It's time for new people to come in, new ideas, new thoughts. Now, I'm not jumping on one side of the debate here. I'm just presenting that there is this debate going on about it. But the bottom line is that if you look at aging research now, and you talk to any major aging researcher, they're going to tell you, no, we're not going to reverse aging. That's not possible. And it comes down to the fact that as we divide, there's a limit. Cells will divide. There's something called the Hayflick limit, discovered by Leonard Hayflick, a prominent researcher in aging in the early 60s. And what he discovered is you can take a fetal cell, you can put it in the perfect petri dish, it will divide roughly 40 to 50 times, it will stop dividing, and the cell will die. Cells are immortal. And researchers recently, incidentally, who won the Nobel Prize in Medicine, proposed a mechanism. They say, well, at the end of every cell is a region of the chromosome, at the end of every chromosome, pictured here is a region called the telomere, and every time the cell divides, it gets shorter and shorter and shorter until the cell can no longer divide. And of course, people jumped on the bandwagon saying we have anti-telomere shortening therapy you can take, and they're making lots of money over it. Not shortening it and not lengthening anyone's lives, I can tell you that. But this mechanism is a proposed built-in fuse, so to speak, within our cell. Now, some cells can circumvent this. Do you want those cells in your body? Those are called cancer cells. Cancer cells are, in essence, immortal cells. They will grow forever if you give them the right environment. The problem is we don't want them to keep growing because you see what happens with them. So it's a warning about the process of life and how certain pathways that maybe we think we can achieve may also be our undoing as well. And aging researchers say, well, it comes down to this. Two basic properties of our universe make us age and prevent us from ever reversing that. Number one is entropy. Entropy means if you have energy in a system, it tends to dissipate over time. And number two is time itself. So if someone invents a time machine, yes, that will be a true anti-aging approach. But unless you can reverse time, you simply can't reverse the changes that occur in our cells and our bodies with that. It's simply not possible. So this is why any anti-aging researcher looks at all these different products out there and smiles and realizes that they're not reversing aging. They're making you look younger, perhaps, maybe feel a little bit younger because you look in the mirror and imagine yourself younger, or indeed, with good skin care, with good upkeep, you can be stronger and look better into old age. Think about what your grandparents and great-grandparents look like when they're in their 70s, 80s, and think about what the average 70 and 80-year-old looks like today. Big difference. When you look at those old photos of people, why is there such a difference? Because you didn't have the same dental care. Most people in their 70s, 80s didn't have a lot of teeth, so that changes the whole shape of their face. I don't think people were using moisturizers back in the 20s and 30s back in the old country, so their skin is more worn for people. They weren't controlling all of their blood pressure, cholesterol, all that. They certainly weren't hitting the gym back in the old country, so people didn't have the same muscle strength. So we indeed can make a lot of changes and make a difference, but you're not reversing the aging process. That's an important thing to take into consideration. So let's talk a little bit about what these changes are, and then let's talk about the potential. If you take a brain and follow its functions over time, this is from the Seattle Longitudinal Study of Aging. They looked at individuals in their 30s, 40s, 50s through their 80s, and they measured discrete cognitive abilities, your word fluency, your memory ability, your mathematical ability. And what you see is that your skills peak roughly between the age of 40 and 60, and then they do decline. And so if you're measuring your mathematical abilities in your 80s, and you're comparing it to the average mathematical abilities of someone in their 30s, it's not going to be the same. There will be declines. And people look at this and they say, well, this is what aging is all about. Decline, decrepitude, loss. This is the aging process. And that you're basically on a slippery slope from changes in memory to mild cognitive impairment to dementia. That it's all about this. And people look at this and this is what they fear about the aging process. And you know, it's not a new fear. Thomas Jefferson wrote to his friend John Adams in 1816, bodily decay is gloomy in prospect, but of all human contemplations, the most abhorrent is body without mind. Would you agree with that? So in 1816, they're still worrying. And believe me, in Roman times, they're worrying the same about losing your mind and what that meant for you. Now, I work with people every day who are facing losses in memory and other cognitive skills. We don't give up on these individuals. Do their lives have any less meaning than mine or anyone else? Absolutely not. And in those circumstances, you really begin to appreciate the essence of being human and what's important and the priorities, and how when someone has meaning and dignity and purpose, that can trump everything. If you simply reduce your value to your memory, and not to denigrate memory and its importance with your identity, but if you value yourself only on that basis, it's a very limited way of looking at things, like that scale of only focusing on aging as by looking at what you lose, what you decline, and focusing on dementia, depression, delirium, despair, delusions, ultimately death. This is my day. This is what I do all day. This is what I'm asked to treat every day. Everyone I see is wrestling with one of these issues. But again, my message is not as black as this slide would imply, because I want to speak to the other side and what we often miss when we get too caught up in this. Because if you look at meaning and purpose in human connections, there aren't the same limits to that as with our bodies. And this is where we really need to see a turning point here. So let me begin to make this case. I want you to answer the following question. When do you think you made better decisions, as a teenager or as an adult? So who here thinks they made better decisions when they were 18 years old? There's always someone. I guess not today. I gave a talk a month ago, and there's a whole row of 18-year-olds in the front row, and I just disrupted the whole flow. Well, why is this? Your teenage brain is as strong, as nimble, as efficient, as pulsing with life as it's ever going to be. Why is not the best time to make decisions? You're flying out of that starting block. You're ready to go forth and be fruitful and multiply. Isn't that the best time of life? What are you missing? Experience, wisdom, but you only get those because of getting older. Does it stop at a certain point? When you reach 65, do you get a letter in the mail saying, you're done? No more wisdom, no more experience, go play golf. At 75, does that letter arrive? What about at 95? Do you get that letter? No. it's not just a matter of a good story that these things continue, but it's science tells us that too, and I want to present that to you. When I wrote How We Age, I interviewed a very well-known cardiologist, Dr. Bernard Lown, Nobel Prize winner. He was 90 at the time, and now he's 93, 94, doing amazing, blogging every day. And he said as he got older, he noticed that his skills were not as sharp, at least how he perceived it. He couldn't remember all the details of the case like he could in years before. But patients, time and time again, were saying, you're a far better doctor now than when we knew you in younger years. And he thought about that, and he said, well, why is that? And he realized that he just had a deeper understanding of the human condition. What joy meant, what sorrow meant, what his patients were going through. At his fingertips, he had a lifetime of experience that he could bring to bear on these cases. And this is such an important component. Now, when I was 19, I had an extraordinary experience. This is what really, for me, opened up the door. I had a small seminar with Erik Erikson, the very famous psychoanalyst. Now, at the time, he was 83, 84. I was 19. What I didn't realize was that he was suffering from dementia. But as a 19-year-old, I didn't know the difference. He sat in the room. He would give a smile, and to me, that was a flash of genius. He would say a few words, and I hung on every word as if this was a parable of good life. You know, I loved that innocence I had at 19. I didn't know what dementia was. I didn't have an understanding for that. But that's a wonderful stance to bring to people you work with, people you spend time with, to kind of clear the board from it and just listen to them and try to see them for what they are, strengths, weaknesses, but everything all together. But what Erikson really taught me were several important points. Number one is that you continue to grow and change throughout your entire life cycle. The die is not cast by the time you're 18 and you're done and no more change and growth. That every stage of life you're wrestling with new issues, new changes, new crises, and all the themes from earlier in life are still there and you're still working on them and weaving them together. And so you have the benefit of all of that experience, good and bad, that you can bring later into life. And so for me, this is what I want to capture from older individuals I encounter, I spend time with, is to learn from them all these elements that I can't even imagine. So that was one thing I learned. The other thing is he talked about the aging process. His perspective was that in our last stage, it's about having a sense of wholeness, of integrity to one's life. Seeing where you've been, what you've done, and realizing that it's had meaning, it's had purpose, versus what a lot of people fall into is a sense of despair, a sense of failure, a sense of disgust over themselves, their bodies, what they've done. And it's not either or. It's a wrestling match. And anyone I've worked with in late life, whether they're facing illness or not, wrestles with this dialectic here. The successes, the triumphs, the accomplishments, and the losses, the decline. At the same time, but the strength emerges from this. The wisdom, the purpose, the connections emerge from this, but you can't do it alone. Now, for the Eriksons, they really faced a very difficult final years. Erik himself was suffering from dementia, most likely Alzheimer's disease. His wife really took over and did most of the speaking and writing for him. And she tacked on a ninth stage of life. And she said, there's much sorrow to cope with, plus a clear announcement that death's door is open and not so far away. And she really was feeling, and I think based on their experiences, that at times the despair, the loss begins to overwhelm everything. And I think for them, indeed, that was an experience. I see this every day. People come to me and they simply say, I can't do it anymore. I can't change. I can't deal with this. I can't bear it anymore. It's been too long. And this is the challenge we face, because not everyone says that, of saying, well, what lies beyond? What else is there? And when I say lie beyond, I don't mean beyond death. I mean in living. What is the potential? What can people do to bring all this together and to make a difference? And this is where Gene Cohen comes to play. I had the really extraordinary opportunity of interviewing Gene Cohen just a few months before he passed away. He was one of the founding fathers of geriatric psychiatry, one of the greatest geriatricians in U.S. history. And he talked about, not so much, and he knew Erickson and he knew Erickson's work, but he talked about potential in late life. When he was a resident, he was assigned to this housing unit in New York City, in Washington, D.C. This is a place where a lot of people, as they were being deinstitutionalized, were sent to these low-income housing units, and they were rough places. Instead of what others warned would be the most depressing of patients, these elderly women and men proved to be among the most alert, attentive, and responsive, a satisfying kind of patient for a doctor who cares. If you're going to go to a doctor late in life, this is the type of doctor you want to go to. Someone who can look beyond the decline, the decrepitude, the challenges, and really see the person. This is what Gene Cohn was able to do. And he was able to see creativity and growth and change. And he talked about 3 elements that bring this to us. So this is where we talk about this potential in late life. He said, number 1, plasticity. We are always able to make changes in our brain structure. And I'm going to talk about this in more detail in the next. But our brains themselves, on the most basic level, on our cellular level, can still grow and develop. Number 2, the way we process emotions, the way we make decisions becomes more mature, more balanced as we get older. And I'll talk about that. And number 3, creativity. It can grow, it can expand, it can change. Think about this. To be a creative person, do you need to have a really great short-term memory? You don't. I can tell you that. I see people doing amazing works of art who can't remember what they did an hour before. That's a strength that endures and grows, and we'll talk a little bit more about that. Because we know, based on the latest in neuroscience, that the brain continues to resculpt itself, to build new pathways, to make new connections. It's not about how many brain cells you have. It's about how well connected they are, which is really a wonderful analogy for our lives. You can be 100 and have Alzheimer's disease and have brain cells that still can make new connections. Now, granted, you're swimming against the tide. We prefer you don't have Alzheimer's disease. We want to cure it, but we don't give up on people. And we know that you still have potential, even in that spot. And this is not based on wishful thinking. This is based on the latest in neuroscience research. These are the elements that grow not in spite of getting older, but because of it. Resilience, wisdom, creativity, emotional maturity, tolerance, purpose, integrity, hope. Now, I don't have time to talk about every one of these, but I want to touch upon a few of these because these are the X factors. These are the elements that in the end make all the difference. And I'm certain that you know people, or you've had personal experiences of individuals who are suffering from illness, are facing challenges, losses, but they're still able to grow, to change, to thrive. Not just about existing and surviving, but about thriving. And I know you've seen that. These are the elements that make the difference. Resilience is the ability to buffer stress, to cope with stress, to maintain a sense of equilibrium despite stress. And resilience is something that, contrary to what a lot of people think, can actually grow as we get older. In fact, when they studied individuals after Hurricane Katrina, what they found is often a lot of the older people did better and coped better and had less PTSD or post-traumatic stress disorder than younger people. I see this in practice often. I see families, there's a loss in the family, and they're afraid to tell the older person. They're afraid they'll collapse, they'll break down. And often it's the opposite. Often the older individual teaches them how to grieve and how to cope because they've been through it before. Their emotions are more balanced, more measured, more mature. We also know that individuals who are more optimistic, who have more social connections, are better able to cope and have greater resilience. We also know that there are genetic factors too. Even your levels of serotonin, which are genetically determined to some extent, can help you cope better. So again, we're not just talking about up in the clouds here. We're talking about on a scientific level as well, that wisdom, resilience, all these elements are built into us and can grow and increase as we get older. I'll give you a quick story of resilience. I worked with a woman who survived Auschwitz. And she came to me because her husband, her beloved husband, who she met and married right after the war, after they both survived, was declining rapidly, and then he passed away. She was very depressed. She herself was having some forgetfulness. And she came to me even speaking of suicide. And I talked to her and I said, well, I need to understand something. You survived Auschwitz. Every single day you opened your eyes could have been your last day. You had no guarantee for the next hour, for the next 24 hours. How did you get by? How did you survive? And she thought about it and she said, I'll tell you. This was an extraordinary. She came in for a 10-minute session. She left my office 2 hours later. And I was a changed person when she walked out. She helped me, I think, more than I did anything for her. And she said, I'm going to tell you something. Number one is, I had faith in God, she said. And I'm not here to endorse any particular religious belief, but she had a faith, a spirituality. She had hope. However you want to cast that hope. She knew that there was something beyond, something that would sustain her, come what may. But she said something else. She said, in the barracks, there were a number of young women from the same area where I came from. She said we clung together. If we had to stand in line for hours on end and one was about to collapse, we would put our arms on that person and strengthen them. If we had to dig ditches and one person couldn't do it anymore, we would grab the shovel and help. She said, that's how I survived. And I thought that really is, that speaks to this human connection. It speaks to the importance of not doing this alone. And so I got her involved in a group we had for people with mild memory impairment. And one day I came to listen to the group, and I hid behind the corner because I wanted to hear them. I didn't want to interrupt. And a woman was speaking, and she said, another woman in the group was saying, I'm losing my memory. It is so painful. And I suddenly heard my patient speak up, and she was a very determined woman, and she said, you cannot give up hope. We are all here together. And I could see this change go through the room there, and I realized that she was giving to others what she really needed for herself. But that was someone beginning to show resilience, coping, and dealing with very, very difficult situation. But she couldn't do it alone. And this is where we come in, because our involvements with older people, we may go in and think we're the ones helping them and providing therapy. I have to tell you, sometimes it's the complete opposite. But that's where the magic takes place. That's what makes all the difference. That's about living better rather than simply living longer. And Gene Cohen talked about how the lifetime of experience can come together and make you think and make decisions in a better way. Now, I'm not saying just because you turn 80 or 90, suddenly you become this wise individual. You can be foolish too. And you can be a very wise 20-year-old. The difference here, we're talking about potential, that you have all these other tools that if you're able to use, and not everyone is, but if you're able to use, you have the potential to really enhance what Cohen called your developmental intelligence. We think about development in terms of kids, in terms of adolescents. They're growing, they're developing, they're going through stages. Still doing it at 80 or 90. But now, as Cohen says, you can integrate in the maturing of your cognition, emotional intelligence, judgment, social skills, life experience, consciousness, all integrated, all synergetic. This may be thinking about Erickson's notion of integrity. It's not just about reflecting back and saying, I've done good, as we think about, but it's about bringing together all of these different life experiences that you have. And when you think about what makes you skilled or competent at something, it's because you're able to take all these different skills that you've acquired and you're able to put it together and bring it to bear on whatever you need to do, whatever the task at hand is. And we know that if you look at the way we change, the way we develop our cognition, we used to think, based on the work of Piaget, that when you became an adolescent, you peaked. You reached what's called formal operations. You can think abstractly, you get your certificate, and you're graduated, you're done. And a lot of researchers say, no, there's another stage, a post-formal stage, where we are able to think less ideologically. We can think more balanced. We can look at a situation and see how we're bringing perspective here, and that it's just one side of the coin. And this really constitutes, when we use this term, wisdom. Wisdom, when you think about it, and I think there's an intuitive sense of what wisdom is, it's about being able to balance out many different factors and take into consideration other different perspectives and enter that into the equation. Wisdom involves not just the way we think about things, but how we feel, our empathy, are able to feel what other people may be feeling, and that takes some creativity as well. Understanding ourselves, being able to give to others and help them, not just in order to gain something, but for the very sake of it. Emotional stability. And so what Cohen says is that if you take this developmental intelligence that we gain, this is the implication for it as we get older. In our adult lives, we can take advantage of this developmental impetus to energize our creativity and jumpstart our efforts to explore new ideas or make desired change. Look at the terms here. Change, explore, jumpstart, creativity, energize, developmental. We're talking about 90-year-olds here. We're not talking about kids. There's a term called gerotranscendence, and people say that as you get older, you even get a greater sense of the cosmos, in a way, of where you fit within the lifespan. And that for many people, time stops being this regimented element, and we begin to have a deeper sense of our place within the web of other people. This is also part of wisdom. Our defense mechanisms can mature. People who are able to channel things, to use humor, to give to others. Everyone has to use defense mechanisms, but these are often healthier ways of coping and dealing with things. The work of George Vaillant in the Harvard study of adults finds, and it's amazing because you read these findings from longitudinal studies of people from when they're in college to in their 80s, and this reads almost like a new age book, but this is based on hardcore science. Good relationships are more influential than events. Key strengths: forgiveness, gratitude, loving kindness. A good marriage at 50 predicts positive aging at 80. There are healthy defenses people use. Alcohol is always bad. Alcohol abuse is always bad. And so these are the conclusions when you look at the balance of things. People have lived a lifetime, and you see why are some people generally content, thriving, doing well despite adversity, and others who either didn't make it or aren't. And these are many of the factors. And again, this is not someone sitting down thinking, oh, I think this sounds good. This is based on studying individuals over 50, 60 years. More evidence backs this up. 340,000 people were polled by a Gallup survey from age 18 to 85. Their stress. When do you think people feel the highest amount of stress? Do you think it's when they're 18 or when they're 80 or somewhere in between? Any guess? What's the peak of stress in the lifespan? Any guess? Middle age? 18, 20. Peak in terms of worry, stress, and it's all downhill from there. Finally, a downhill you want to be on. 85-year-olds, least amount of stress and worry. Do you believe this? Lots of data backs this up. When I give talks throughout Florida, the average age in the audience is about 80. And I'm always a little nervous when I first begin doing this because I think they're going to stand up and say, you don't know what you're talking about. You're young, you haven't experienced this is all BS. I find the opposite. People come to me afterwards, all they want to share with me is what they're doing, their new activities, their new artistic creations, their new relationships that they're in, and believe me, they want to share everything. So it really supports this. Lots of data backs this up. How about well-being, happiness? When are people most content in life? What age do you think? 18? 30? 50? Okay, we start off pretty good at 18 and 20. 18 and 20-year-olds are generally pretty happy people. Whew. Downhill. 50-year-olds, not doing so hot. And when you think about it, this is probably the peak of responsibility, dealing with both sides of the life cycle. Lots of things people have to deal with. Again, the 80-year-olds, 85-year-olds, most content people across the scale. Not just because of life circumstances. Everyone in that scale in 85 were facing things. But I think it has to do with how our bodies and brains change in ways that also help us and give us potential that we can realize as we get older. Creativity is one of the most important things. The secret of living with one's entire being, Cohen writes, is a creative spirit that dwells in each of us. It can occur at any age and under any circumstances. but the richness of experience that age provides us magnifies the possibilities tremendously. Perfect example, Matisse, the great artist. When he was in his early 70s, he had a major abdominal surgery. He was confined to a wheelchair for the rest of his life. This was around 1940, 1941. Think about the state of medical care in France during the war for a 72-year-old. He might as well have been a 90-year-old lying bedbound. Was Matisse's life over then? He couldn't stand and stretch and paint the way he could before. So he told his assistant, bring the color papers to my bed or my wheelchair, bring me a scissors, and he started cutting out shapes. He created an entirely new art form. Some of his greatest works. He was leading the art world, not fading away. And he reflected upon this. In his last year, created the most sublime stained glass window for a chapel. He said, I've needed all that time to reach the stage where I can say what I want to say. I think this is the most important line of the entire talk. He's needed all that time. He's needed aging to say, do, think, feel how he's always wanted to. This is like the 83-year-old that I thought was so depressing. She's saying, no, this is what I want to tell you. This is what I want to say. And it's my job to listen and not come in and tell her what she needs to think or feel at that point. And this creativity is not just for artists. Some people look at it and say, okay, but that was Matisse. He was a great artist. No. Creativity is not just about creating a painting, a sculptor. It's about dealing with a problem, dealing with a different generation, working in a relationship. You need to be creative to know what someone else is thinking or feeling, to imagine, to come up with solutions to roadblocks. Creativity is in every aspect of our lives. And Cohen says we can put all this together and realize that as you get older, we face what are called, he calls these the human potential phases. A midlife reevaluation phase between 35 and 65, a liberation phase between 55 and 75, summing up phase between 70 and 90, and an encore. This is not about curling up in bed and waving goodbye and writing your will. He's saying forget it. Forget about this midlife crisis stuff that people are so focused on. This is a midlife reevaluation. People are rediscovering things. In my book, I tell this amazing story of a woman who, during the Second World War, lost what she thought her 4 children. When she was sent away to the camps, she put her children in an orphanage. When she came back at the end of the war, they had been taken away to a camp. And yet what she discovered, the Red Cross discovered one of her children had been saved. So she had this little boy, and he survived. Now, when I worked with this woman in her 90s, this son used to come see me all the time. He said, it's a miracle I even exist in this world. When I was flying up here the other morning, I'm walking off the plane, about 9 in the morning, and who did I see walking towards me at LaGuardia? Her son. And I'm shocked because 2 months ago, I was walking through LAX, and who did I bump into? Her son. What is he doing? He's in his 70s. He has this whole new music video he's producing. He's not a music video producer, mind you. He's come up with this whole new musical form. He's bringing together singers from Latin America, from different parts of this country. They put a whole video together. He's out and about creating, doing amazing things. That speaks to the potential. That speaks to a liberation phase. We think of liberation when you're 20s, 30s. No. This is what people are doing now. This is what every person in this room, I bet, is doing in many respects, too. You're not sitting here because this is the end of the day, you're retired, and you just want to hear a good talk. That's okay. I hope it's a good talk. But you're here because you're growing, you're learning, you're making changes, and it's not going to stop tomorrow. It's not going to stop next year, and I bet if you're vigorous and healthy, when you're 90, you're still going to want to be doing that. This is the future, because it's likely in the next 30, 40 years that we will have cures or treatments for most forms of cancer. I'm still waiting for that pill that you take and it clears out your arteries and your heart is going to do great. It's going to come one of these days. They're already experimenting with it. And we will have a cure for Alzheimer's disease, I'm certain, in the next 50 years. So what that means is for our grandchildren, our great-grandchildren, when they turn 65, they're going to have another 40, 50 years ahead of them free of cancer, heart disease, dementia. Think about that. What are you going to do with that time? People are going to be starting new things, creating, getting into new relationships, all sorts of things. Late life is going to be radically different. Not because we're living to be 100 and 120 routinely, but because we will be stronger, healthier, more involved, realizing this potential that increases. The 90-year-olds are going to laugh at the 18 and 20-year-olds and say, you don't have a thing on me because I have all this time and all this experience. And I'll give you two quick stories, and then we'll wrap up. Verdi, probably the most famous operatic composer. When he was in his late 20s, he composed a comic opera. It debuted at La Scala, the famous, probably the most famous opera house in the world, in Milan. It was a complete flop, closed after one day. He walked out of that opera house, and mind you, in the time he'd created this comic opera, which he thought would be one of his signature creations, both of his children and his wife had both died within the last 2 years. He said, I'm done. I'm not writing any more operas. I'm giving up music. Luckily, he had some people who cared for him. They said, don't give up. Give some time, don't give up. He got back. He started writing again, created amazing operas. Now he's in his 80s. He's never gone back and done a comic opera. He said, I'm going to try again. He writes a comic opera, Falstaff. Debuts again at La Scala. Major success. Huge triumph for him. It has taken him all that time to finally say what he wanted to say. And he was able to do that. It doesn't mean that everyone here has to write a great opera, paint an amazing work of art, but it's a matter of finding ways in your own lives and the lives of people that you work with to be able to achieve that potential, to do something which gives you meaning, gives you purpose, because that's what makes the difference. That gives you connections with other people. And Cohen says you can assemble this into a portfolio, like you have a financial portfolio of things you can do in a group, things you can do individually, things you can do if you have a lot of mobility and energy, things you can do if you don't. And that we need to take stock of these assets and bring them to bear in our lives in the same way you do that with your finances. And this social portfolio is a creative act, and it gets other people involved in it. And nowadays you can not be able to move, you can have one finger that you can twitch, and you can get on the internet and sail the universe. And it's remarkable when you see people in their 80s and 90s using technology to explore new worlds. So this is the world that we live in now that can help us realize this. Because you can focus on everything we lose, and these are heartbreaking, difficult things that can tip the balance for lots of people. But we can't lose sight of what we gain when we get older. These strengths, we have this potential that can make all the difference. Because I would assert, and what I assert in my books here, are that it's not aging itself that makes the difference at the end, in the last few years of life, but it's the loss of dignity, of meaningful relationships, of vital activity, and of hope that can tip the balance. But these are things we can do something about. We're not going to cure the aging process, but dignity, meaning, vital activity, we can do things about that. We can help others to realize this. We can realize this in ourselves. So let me give you one final story, and then we'll, if you have any questions or comments. So I was in my office waiting for the next patient, and I actually heard her down the hall. I heard a woman screaming from down the hallway, "Why am I here? Doctor, why am I here?" And I opened her chart, and I saw that this is a woman in her 80s. She'd been living alone. She had some memory impairment. She fell. She broke her hip, had surgery, ended up in the nursing home. The last thing she wanted to do, I can guarantee you that morning, was come talk to a psychiatrist. They wheeled her in. She was crying. She was exhausted. She was bedraggled. And I thought, there's just no way I can sit and go through the whole interview with her. And I just looked at her and I said, "Tell me who you are. Tell me something about yourself." And she began talking about herself. Her short-term memory wasn't good. She couldn't tell me what she had for breakfast that morning. She couldn't tell me what she did the last couple of days. She could tell me about her life and who she was. And as she began speaking, I noted how she calmed down. She was more engaged. She stopped crying. And so I turned to her and said, "I want to ask you a question." I said, "Tell me, what is your most precious memory?" I love asking this because it gives you such a window into someone. And she said, "Doctor, that's easy." She said, "I once danced with Fred Astaire." And I looked at her and I was amazed. And she explained how her husband had been an attorney and did work for Fred Astaire. And she said she spent many an enchanted evening with Fred Astaire and Ginger Rogers, and that's how she came to dance with him. So I said, you have to tell me, what was it like to dance with Fred Astaire? You can bet she said, heaven. So I wheeled her out to the front of the clinic. I told all the staff, everyone gathered around her. She was like a movie star herself. Everyone wanted to know what was it like and tell us about it. She was beaming. This is a woman who 20 minutes before had been crying, had been disconnected. Now she was like a new person. There was no anti-aging lotion or potion or pill within that 20 minutes. It was simply about letting someone say what they want to say, giving her the time and space, giving her some dignity, some meaning. That made all the difference. And this is something we all have the ability to do for others, and ultimately we do for ourselves. So I'm going to leave you with one last quote. This is from the great American poet Henry Wadsworth Longfellow. He wrote, "For age is opportunity no less than youth itself, though in another dress. And as the evening twilight fades away, the sky is filled with stars, invisible by day." So I want to thank you so much for your attention this morning. I think we have about maybe 10 minutes or so. Any questions, any comments? And everything I talked about today is in my book, How We Age, but in an expanded form, lots of stories. It's really the aging process, but told through stories of people I've worked with. And if you do clinical work, I also put a lot of this into, this is a book called Therapy with Older Clients, where I really walk through, if you're working with someone older, how do you understand the impact of aging on their personality, on their depression, on their mental health, and what can you do about it? And we walk through lots of different therapies. You don't have to be necessarily a trained therapist to engage in this. I talk about end-of-life issues, and I know afterwards I have a few of these that they're selling, and I'd be happy to sign it. So, questions, comments, anything? Any reflections?
They do work. They work when you're in the right place anyway. So we have microphones. Amy over there.
Good morning. My name is Angel Basu, and I'm from Adult Protective Services. And I've learned that just giving them the opportunity to talk is very important. Recognizing them makes them feel even more important. Mm-hmm. So time is important. So sometimes we just have to give to get back a little something.
Absolutely. And unfortunately, in so many circumstances, we don't give people that opportunity to talk because we walk in already with our agenda. And sometimes the best thing is just to sit and not say a word and just, as you said beautifully, let them talk and express themselves. Let them say what they want to say. Yes.
If someone is a senior, not that old of a senior, and they feel like they're having sightings, so maybe it's a mental problem, if they have therapy, do they have to be medicated, or can they somehow, how flexible is the brain into coming back to a place of health?
So the question is, you have someone in late life, they're having, do you mean like hallucinations, that thing? Someone is having some mental health issue, depression, psychosis, they're really wrestling with things. How much can the brain do? How much do we need to help it along? And it's variable, but a few rules of thumb. Number one is that you need to get the whole picture. You need to know not only what's the problem, but what are their strengths? What are you going to use to get this person better? So, you come into a household in your protective services and you're dealing with some really difficult issues, but even in those circumstances, there are strengths people have, either relationships or skills or whatnot, that if you don't understand, all you're doing is just painting a picture of pathology. You're not really getting from step A to B. So sometimes by giving someone time, space, working with them therapeutically, that can be enough for people. Sometimes the pathology will get better on its own. Sometimes it's posing a risk you need to assess and you need to help it along, and this is where medications come in. Most of the time what people come to me is for medications because that's my training, but that's not my first instinct. And you really want to assess what's the urgency. Is someone in pain? But one thing we face is there's still a tremendous stigma to mental illness, and individuals won't hesitate to treat someone aggressively if they're complaining of physical pain, but they take their time and don't take seriously mental pain. It's pain, it's suffering, and we need to address them on equal terms and put aside these notions of someone has a moral failing or whatnot just because they're depressed or they're struggling with something. If we apply that stigma to mental illness, then we're really in trouble. So to me, this is one of the main messages, is that it doesn't mean it's a pill, it doesn't mean it's a form of therapy, but it's a matter of recognizing if there is mental illness, the importance of getting treatment, because most people can do very well, and I can tell you from studying people in their 80s and 90s and above that they will respond and do well to treatment as much as younger people do. We have to get over this prejudice that we all have that somehow you're too old to make changes, because it's simply not true. Yes?
Is there a pattern in psychiatry where a person will go to the psychiatrist and right away, within 1 hour of knowing a person, they get medication? Isn't that inappropriate?
Yeah,
in a sense?
this is a great question. You send someone to, say, a psychiatrist, and they walk out with a pill after an hour. How much does the person really know about them? They don't, often. You know, it's a matter of triage. It's like if you come into the emergency room and you're complaining of a headache, the doctor's not going to be able to determine within the period that he assesses you that this is really due to stress, or this is due to a fight you had with your spouse or partner, or this is due to the fact that you had too much to drink last night, or, there could be 100 factors. They're focusing on a small spot. You have pain, this is the likely cause, this is a solution. And there's something to be said for that. That's important because people want relief. You want to be able to walk out at that hour because you might only have that hour. The important thing is, especially if you're involved with someone, to make certain that it's not just that hour, that you're looking at the bigger picture. Some people can walk out of that hour and the medication is appropriate and will make a difference, but they need follow-up, they need more time and attention, and you can give that time to do that. So it's a way of saying it's part of the picture, it's not the entire picture. Well, it shouldn't be like an emergency room. If you're seeing a psychiatrist or a psychologist, it's a relationship that they establish with the person. That's important. And I find most people, when they're unhappy with any doctor, any clinician they're working with, it's because there's not a connection, there's not a relationship, that someone sees them, they do what they need to do, then they're on to the next person. That may be appropriate if you have a surgeon who needs to come in and put a cast on you. You don't necessarily have to have a long-standing therapeutic relationship with the orthopedist doing that. Although sometimes that can make a difference. It depends on the circumstances. So, yes.
Obviously, what you're saying, is this on? Yeah. Obviously, what you're saying is you need to look at the whole picture, and I'm not trying to get an answer without having that as part of it. But if you have someone who's functioning very well, generally speaking, but they are starting to have some memory lapses and issues, do you have a time when you would suggest, or a certain time when you see differences in that memory, that you would suggest using some medications like Aricept and Namenda, some of those kinds of things, that would help to maintain the memory? And when would that be? Sure.
So the question is, if you're working with someone and you do note memory problems, and my guess is every single person here in the room has situations like that, when do you know when you really have to act, when our medications are appropriate and whatnot? And you might know this person well and recognize their strengths. It doesn't mean that you're ignoring the memory issues and that you're wishing it away. And this is where it's important that people have a comprehensive assessment. And usually what this means is not only seeing their doctor to make sure you've looked at any medical issues and ruled them out or ruled them in, but you get memory testing done, what we call neuropsychological testing, so you know what's the spectrum. What are their strengths? What are their weaknesses? Do we think this is Alzheimer's? Do we think this is something else? That knowledge, that tentative diagnosis is going to guide the medications you choose. And in my next talk upstairs, if you're there, I'll go into more detail about that. It's not a simple issue. Medications for Alzheimer's disease can bring a little bit of benefit. It's really about having someone connected with services, connected with their doctors to make sure that these issues are dealt with over time and as they evolve over time. So I think we're right at 10:30. Maybe we'll take one last question, then I'm going to go over to, there's a room in the corner there that there's books, because we have about 15 minutes before the next session starts. If you'd like to get one, I will be there. So question here, yeah.
I wanted to ask a question about the graphs you showed about the most happiest and the less stressed.
Yes.
Were they factored in for men and women, or
Yes.
both?
Both men and women. You can even find it online. It's a Gallup survey. If you just do, Gallup survey, 340,000 people, well-being. It's really easy to find on the internet. But they looked at both. It's limited because it was a phone survey for the most part. So there are limitations, but lots of other studies corroborate that information.
Please join me in thanking Dr. Gronin for his presentation.